vulnerability, some people think that vulnerability is about basically open up your ribcage, pouring from your heart and telling all the details of all your failures in life and love and whatever it has, right? Mm-hmm. But you can be vulnerable by being personal without being private.
Good morning, Fredrik.
Good morning, Paul.
Thank you very much for jumping on here and having a little discussion with me. We met just a couple of months ago, and you are a executive coach, and you've been working in corporates, in the corporate world for about 20 years, and the last 5 with leadership development. And we've had a lot of discussions about the subject of vulnerability. And that's something that's still a little bit of a puzzle for me sometimes, and I'm trying to figure out what is the correct use and why is this an advantage in the business world, and how do I do it properly, or can I learn it if I don't know how to do it, all of that kind of stuff. So we're going to record a couple of questions here and see where the discussion goes and see if it's something that's valuable to share with other people.
Good. Very good.
Great. Mm-hmm. So maybe if we can start off with, there's this where we all have strengths and weaknesses. We know that, right? But what is the connection now between our weaknesses and vulnerability, or what's the difference between of those?
I would say that weakness is probably the opposite of vulnerability, actually. If we talk about weakness of character in this context, rather than physical weakness, any type of weakness, no, weakness of character. I would say weakness of character is when you rely on authority rather than authenticity. When you don't have the strength to be who you are and show up real, so you have to use your authority that's been formally given to you to get things done. That's weakness of character, I would say, to make it simple. I think it's a good starting point, at least, for starting to unpack what weakness and vulnerability in these things mean.
Okay, so but if I do have particularly things that I'm, if I'm really good at, facilitating meetings, but I'm bad at structuring decision-making processes or something like that, how do I deal with that then? Or how does vulnerability play into that kind of setup?
Well, let's first just try to define vulnerability, or talk a bit more, unpack what it means. Mm-hmm. And I think vulnerability is about having the courage to show up and be real when you cannot control the outcome. Mm-hmm. So vulnerability is about emotional honesty in situations where there's some potential threat or uncertainty, right? Mm-hmm. So vulnerability is basically about, so to use your example, it's about just being emotionally honest about it and say, I don't know how to do this. Simple. Can you help me?
I notice you use the word emotionally honest. So honest, that means telling the truth, but then also emotionally honest on top of that as well. What do you mean by that?
No, emotionally honest as in saying, I have some insecurity around this. So for example, I will ask you, or use your example of I cannot structure this. Remember that asking for help is a strength. And in doing so, you can show vulnerability. You can ask for help in 2 ways. I can tell you, Paul, can you help me with this thing? Here's a step-by-step instruction. Go and have it done and deliver by Tuesday. Mm-hmm. That's not vulnerability. But I can also ask for help in the sense of saying, Paul, when it comes to this thing, I don't really know how to do it. I feel very insecure about presenting this to the board. Could you please support me here figuring this thing out? Mm-hmm. You're emotionally vulnerable. There's uncertainty because I don't know how you will perceive that. Mm-hmm. But I have the courage to show up and be real and say, I don't know this. Can you help me figure it out?
So there's a risk that I might actually look stupid or get like a bad response or something like that, or I might not be received in my,
There is a risk, but I think we tend to make a big thing out of this potential risk. In reality, the risk is very small. Because what happens when you show vulnerability is that you give permission for others to be vulnerable. Mm-hmm. And all of us are struggling in life to some extent, right? Mm-hmm. Suffering is part of the human experience. And this is actually quite interesting because when I work with leaders, I quite often use a 360 tool that goes into reactive tendencies and leadership competencies. And it's really looking at the underlying behaviors, underlying thought patterns and behaviors of an individual. And one of the things we look at is integrity. So how are they perceived by their peers, by their boss, and by the reports in the area of integrity? And getting a low score there really hurts for a lot of people, right? Because integrity has become this thing that we need to really have. But these people quite often get a low score. I very often see that when I work with leaders. So the interesting thing then is why. And there are typically two interpretations of low integrity. One is that you don't stand up and do what you said you're going to do, or that you change your opinion all the time, or you say one thing here, but do something else here, right? That's one thing. This is typically not what this low score indicates. But what it does indicate is that a lot of leaders show up at work with a professional self. Mm-hmm. And they only come there and are professional. They are their role. They are the accountant. They are the CEO. They are the sales leader, whatever it is. In the professional role, they have everything under control and everything is pum, 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 pum. They have all the answers. They give all the directions. Now, the thing is, everybody is struggling, and we know that. So when you meet a person who always shows that perfect role on top of everything, we sense that there's something more to this person. There is something under the surface. This person is struggling in some ways just as I'm doing. So this low score of integrity is often about not having a feeling of knowing the entire human, just knowing a particular part that they choose to present. Mm-hmm. And that is the part about introducing vulnerability and showing that I'm human too. Mm-hmm. And that is an opportunity to build trust, right?
Mm-hmm. So this low integrity do you think that's a fairly widespread thing? If people haven't taken your test, how would they notice in themselves? What would you say would be signs that they could notice, like, oh, there's something that's not quite lined up here? Is that just like noticing that, oh, I'm always in my professional role and maybe it's getting tiring to have this kind of professional mask on the whole time and always be on top of things? Or is there other things that you think would indicate that?
Well, I think to start answering that, I think first of all, I believe that you're one human. You cannot compartmentalize parts of your life. So you are one person at work, one at home, one as a friend, one as that. You're one human, and the underlying beliefs, thought patterns, and behaviors of all these different places where you show up will spill into each other. Mm-hmm. If you have a tough day at work, that's probably going to spill into how you are at home. Mm-hmm. If your marriage is about to break, that's probably going to spill into how you show up at work. So you're one human. And as you mature, or as a child, you are programmed with certain beliefs systems, certain value systems that you then bring with you through life. And as you mature, it's about starting to examine, how do they help me? What do they do to me? So what I'm looking at is these underlying thought patterns and beliefs to show, how do you show up specifically under pressure? And then we have certain tendencies towards being very compliant when you're under pressure, for example, or maybe you're very protective, or maybe very marriage-driven, controlling. Do it my way, blah 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 blah. Mm-hmm.
So I'm hearing like if I'm really radically different people in all these different settings, but I'm noticing that maybe there's some spillover happening that I'm no longer actually able to control, then that's also a warning sign that. And maybe that's where this integrity thing is playing in as well.
Yeah, that definitely integrity plays in. But I think the essence here, when it comes to vulnerability, is about vulnerability is an opportunity for building trust. Mm-hmm. And without trust, it's very difficult to really engage people, mm-hmm. And have them to join the journey, whatever journey you're on. Mm-hmm. So trust.
And what happens if I don't trust? I mean, when you were talking originally about this, then I was thinking like, okay, well, what happens on my first week on the job? I went up to my boss and I was like, hey, I really don't know how to do this. I think it's very complicated and da 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 da. And my boss was just like, I don't have time for you, whatever. Can't you figure out he's stupid or something like that, right?
Yeah.
Then what do I do there then, right? Is that just a toxic environment or?
Yeah, you get a new boss.
Get a new boss. Mm-hmm.
No, but I mean, that reminds me of something. When I started working back in 98, 99, the first boss, or like the big boss of the department I was in, he taught me my first two leadership lessons. And one was, he said, as a leader, you always have 5 minutes. Mm-hmm. If somebody comes to you, you always have 5 minutes. I think it's what Brené Brown would call the sliding door moment. Mm-hmm. Those 5 minutes, which is an opportunity to get to know each other a little bit better and build trust. Mm-hmm. And then if it takes more than 5 minutes, you can always say, let's take this another time. I really want to understand what's going on there. So can we schedule some time for tomorrow, whatever. I think what you described here is this fear that if I come to my boss of the first week and say, I don't know how to do this, how likely is that really to happen? It's something you build up in your head. That, okay, I have to be strong, I have to show that I know everything, I will need to impress people, blah, 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 right? But how likely is it actually to happen? If you ask about the same question 15 times, yes, your boss might doubt your capacity and your competence, and if you're the right hire. But I think we tend to make two big things out of this. I think the most overlooked aspect in business is that we're all human. So if we can connect on a human to human, we can recognize our own weaknesses and doubts and also strengths and all the good stuff in each other, and that builds a bond and builds trust.
And what I'm also thinking as you're talking is just as leaders, the way that we act and the openness and vulnerability that we show, and also, revealing at suitable times that, okay, there's also things where I don't know and where other people, I might need their help and input. That also kind of empowers employees to do the same thing instead of putting on the brave face and trying to do things that they're actually not qualified or not trained to be able to do, right?
No, exactly. But I think, that triggers two thoughts in me. First, choose certain moments where I can be vulnerable. That's kind of starting to understand what the concept is all about. But if you show up as a real leader and vulnerable, you don't choose your moments. You are just you. And being human means that there are things you don't know, you don't understand, and you connect to other people in order to better understand. It's a learning opportunity. And I think the other thing that it triggers in me as well is, as a leader, things you don't know. What you said there, I think that's important to pick up on, because your role as a leader is not to be the person knowing. Your role as a leader is to be the person enabling other people to create whatever they are creating. And I meet this challenge a lot when I'm out there in companies working with leaders, because when you start out as a manager and then you advance your way up, you are typically rewarded for your expertise. So the best accountant becomes team lead for the accounting team. The best sales guy becomes sales manager, etc. So this idea that you're really good at something is reinforced, and you start to build identity as, okay, I'm the great accountant, so I'm going to be the CFO, right? However, when you then step into true leadership, it's not about how good you are at accounting or how good you are at sales that matters. It's about your ability to enable other people to give their gift to the company in accounting or sales, whatever it is. And this is typically quite a big challenge, because it causes a bit of a shortcut or a threat to the ego. Because you spend 10, 15, 20 years building up your ego around about being the great accountant, and then suddenly that doesn't produce results you want to produce, because your role as a leader is to enable other people.
So it could even be counterproductive. If I've been the guy who's been rewarded for having all the answers all the time, and then I carry on with that strategy, I actually need to unlearn that and maybe even occasionally create space for other people to have the answers and listen really carefully to their answers instead of pushing through mine to be able to create that collaborative environment. Yeah,
exactly. Because if you're the person that always have all the answers, and you have this need to protect the story about yourself being the guy who have all the answers, in the end you're going to be very lonely. Because as a leader, it's not fun to work for that type of leaders. Yeah.
Well, they're going to feel, your employees are going to feel like you're kind of like competing with them almost and pushing them down so that you can feel better about yourself. Exactly. And probably you do. And so you're going to be giving them a lack of self-worth complex. Well, okay. Well, I mean, it's a complicated topic, this actually, because there's also this idea of fake vulnerability as well, where you mentioned a little bit that, sometimes we choose moments and so we kind of fake it. And so, what does that look like, and how do we avoid fake vulnerability?
Well, fake vulnerability, I think maybe there has to be an element of fake vulnerability in the beginning as you start to approach the aspect of you that could possibly be vulnerable, if you're not used to that. And I think fake vulnerability, let's just say one more thing about vulnerability, because vulnerability, some people think that vulnerability is about basically open up your rib cage, pouring from your heart and telling all the details of all your failures in life and love and whatever it has, right? Mm-hmm. But you can be vulnerable by being personal without being private. Mm-hmm. So I can be vulnerable towards you in a personal way, saying, Paul, I'm really struggling with this thing here. I can't figure this piece out. Mm-hmm. But I know you have some experience. Could you help me figure out how to do this? Mm-hmm. Then I'm personal. Or I can be personal to say, Paul, I can't really focus today. I have some stuff going on at home and I really need to take some time off. Is it okay if so I'm very personal with you. I show vulnerability. Without being private, I don't have to share that the reason I feel unfocused today or have stuff going at home is because my wife just asked for a divorce and I found out my daughter has this and, world's crashing down. Mm-hmm. I don't have to get into the private details of it. I can still be personal. Mm-hmm. So I think some people, when they approach the topic of vulnerability, they think it's all about the private part, but it's not. Mm-hmm. You can choose to add that in when appropriate, but it's just about being personal, recognizing we're both humans and share on a human level.
Yeah, that really makes me, so we've been running these retreats and gatherings for men for a long time. And what really hits me every time is the weight that so many men are bearing around with themselves all the time, and how incredibly good they are at that, right? They're amazing. Like I'm blown away and amazed by how guys are able to, just endure so much and not complain about it and not, moan and not whatever. And then sometimes when you then create that space, then it's like the floodgates open and everything comes out, right? And so yeah, there's a need for being able to modulate or moderate this kind of thing, and that takes a little bit of training maybe to learn how to do, and maybe originally in a safe space that you can then train someplace and then be able to carry it over into an actual working environment.
Yeah, some training, and also, it's courage at the end of it, isn't it? Right? Mm-hmm. It's about daring to show up, to be real when you cannot control the outcome. Mm-hmm. And we touched on courage a couple of times when we talked as well. And I think I like what Rollo May is saying in his book, A Man's Search for Himself. He says that the opposite of courage in today's society is not cowardice, but conformity. Mm-hmm. So if we live in a society that role models the man as a strong, silent type that solves everything himself, and is just, if that's what we all men try to conform to, mm-hmm. Of course, it's going to be hard to show that you are vulnerable. There are areas you can't figure out. There are things where you doubt yourself, etc., and ask for help, right? Mm-hmm. So I think the work we do with the manifesto and men's work around the world is so important. And actually, the reason I first came to men's work was when I'm out working with leaders, there's one element of the work I do is where I am very vulnerable. And I share my story through corporate and burnout and things. And at the end of it, there's always a man or two coming up to me saying, "Hey, Fredrik, it's so nice to see a strong, powerful man being so vulnerable." Because then I realize I'm not alone with my thoughts and it's okay to talk about it. Mm-hmm. And that's when I started to realize that there's so much contained frustration in men. Mm-hmm. And we need to provide a platform for men to talk.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah. So what are the consequences of not doing that? I know that's something we've had a couple of conversations about, but what happens if we're not able to find that vulnerability, or if we feel like we need to? And I think it's a journey that both of us have been down to a certain extent, right?
Yeah. I think there are two consequences of it. One is the consequence in the public space, so to speak. If you're a leader, if you try to engage other people, you have an idea of going somewhere and want people to join you. If you don't show vulnerability, meaning showing that you're human too, mm-hmm. and engage on a human level, you're going to become very lonely. Mm-hmm. And it puts you in a position where people don't really know if you're going to trust you. You probably have to use authority rather than authenticity to get things done. Mm-hmm. And it's not fun to work for that type of leader. And I met many of those leaders. And And quite often they are quickly approaching burnout or playing on the border of burnout because they have to do a lot of stuff themselves. And importantly, they have to do a lot of mitigating to make sure they uphold their ego story of themselves as being the person that knows, that has authority, that drives, you know. So that's one consequence. I think on the personal space, I think by containing all the suffering we experience through life, and I say all the suffering, you know, as an expression, but suffering is certainly part of the human experience. If you contain that and never talk about it, share it, we're going to build up frustration and resentment and possibly regret. And that's going to come out somehow. For some people, they stop and say, well, there's got to be more to life than this. And they seek a spiritual path to some extent, religious or not, but some type of spiritual path. Other people try to push that away. And I quite often see that ending up in the shadow sides of spirituality, which could be, you know, seeking alcohol to numb the pain, or sex or drugs, or, you know, extramarital affairs, or whatever it could be, in order to push away that pain of not allowing yourself to be human and connect.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And addictions seem to be, it's this thing that when we don't have real people to turn to with our pain, then whenever something hard happens, then we turn to our addictions instead, if that's smoking or pornography or whatever as well. And that becomes our best friend. And what a lonely life that is, right? So yeah, I think the latest research, and I haven't studied it too much in detail, but I think it shows that alcoholism is actually not a medical condition; it's actually a social condition. It's not, you know, triggered by some genetic defect or anything like that. It's actually just an expression of loneliness. Yeah, I often see this. I've read about this research that shows, like, the rats where they were fed, they could either have cocaine water or normal water, and when they were in like a really boring cage, then they got very quickly addicted to cocaine. But as soon as they were in like rat playland and there was lots of entertainment for them, they weren't interested in the cocaine because they instinctively, their bodies knew this is not good for me, and there's other things that I can get enjoyment and meaning out of as well, and I think that's very true for humans also. So I also see a lot of guys who are very focused on these addictions, but they don't, you know, that kind of gives that can give that more addiction as well, more energy sometimes as well, instead of focusing on, well, what's my positive vision for how I'm becoming more present, more real, more in contact with the people that I'm working with, and then often that other stuff becomes less interested. Okay, and then I just want to let's finish off with talking about, you know, that's the downside. What's the plus side? What happens? I was just thinking, you know, in my 8 years that I worked in a corporate environment, I never found this. I would say I was certainly playing that role to a certain extent, and I remember seeing some people where we would come to meetings, and no matter what happened at this meeting, and no matter what other people, you know, who had different opinions, whatever, they knew what they stood for, and they stood up for us, and they argued for us, and they you know, they listened, they were, you know, whatever, but they actually, when you spoke about courage, and I was thinking, there's also a courage sometimes in kind of saying, like, this is the right thing for our company, this is what our values and our vision is, and this is where we want to go, and I have a strong belief that that's how we want to go there. That can be a scary thing to do as well, right? But those are the people that I also saw had that rocket fuel to really be making a difference.
And I guess that comes down to integrity. And integrity, if it really comes from your heart, if it's really what you believe in, versus when it's something your boss have told you to say in order to get the numbers up, right? And I think, and that's great, you know, if it is delivered in such a way that people feel inspired to join you on your journey, right? There's a big difference between having all that passion and say, this is what I'm going to do, argue for it, and get all the people to, you know, sign the dotted line, compared to telling the story in a compelling way, so people are really excited about joining you in this journey. And that's all you have to do. People are queuing up to join you because they're so excited about the story you're told, about the vision and how you're going to get there together as a team, etc.
Yeah. which requires that there's that you're actually putting yourself out there to a certain extent and showing yourself as a real human. That's how you can kind of that's the way we create these connections.
Because you need trust to do that, right? You know,
Mm-hmm.
if you show up only with your professional self, people's going to doubt, is that this guy for real?
Mm-hmm.
He seems to have no problem, seems to be in control of everything, you know. He doesn't ever give me any clue of actually being human. And I know that I have all these issues, you know, so he must have some too. What can he share that? And then it's very hard to build trust. And if you don't have trust, you can't engage the people on your journey, whatever it is you want to do.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate the way that you connected integrity and vulnerability in the beginning of our talk. It came back as well there, and then how that can foster trust to really move. I just read a really old classical book called From Good to Great, Jim Collins. I'm sure you've heard of it, right? And I was really actually, you know, there's some really solid stuff there about that level 5 leader that they speak about, and how he kind of brings together and with this attitude of humility for his personal ego, but extremely ambitious on the behalf of the company, right? And so he's able to create that drive, but it's not about him, it's about the people he's working with, really, about gathering that team and lifting people up. So yeah. Great. Well, Fredrik, you're doing this professionally with people all around the world. You've been doing it for a long time. Where should people find you and read more about your work if they're interested in understanding a little bit more of the way you're working with?
So the easiest thing is to go to my name.com, so fredriklyhagen.com. Mm-hmm. And then also we have now this mentoring launch with Manifesto, right? I'm honored to be one of the mentors there to support the men's movement in Europe under your guidance. Yeah,
well, in our collective guidance, I would say very much. But yeah, that's manifesto.com/mentors, plural. So far, we've just launched that page, and that's putting out from the group mentoring program that we're running called Manifesto Core. So really exciting to see how that's going to be taking off from here. So thanks very much, Fredrik. Great talking to you.
Thank you, Paul.
Great.